Okay. Okay. Turn these down a bit. Okay. Alright. So yeah, I'll post this. I'll post this to YouTube, like for the first video on the playlist, separate from the actual game. So yeah, we're gonna be talking about the Reformation today for a little bit as a background for playing Pentiment. Let me turn that down just a little bit more. So, again, I haven't like really looked into much of the game, other than like knowing that the setting is around, you know, like the early 1500s, kind of going to the I think mid 1520s, going on into the 40s or something. There's a couple of like references I've like seen get brought up, like book-wise, like I know Cheese and the Worms gets brought up, and then Martin Gare a little bit, but those are just like little footnotes, so, like nothing like big spoilery. Like we're gonna pretty much be going into this blind, but I just wanted to give a background before we kind of get into it. There's probably gonna be a little codex explaining everything down the way, but I kind of wanted to just do this on my own. So, talking about the Reformation, I kind of wanted to like go back a little bit instead of just like, you know, starting with Luther, because he doesn't just pop out of nowhere. You could probably even go back further than like some of these events listed here, but I think these Codex Protestant faction confirmed. Like, if you really wanted to like make the argument, you could like, you know, put church division like all the way back with like Peter and Paul, but like that's kind of getting to like nerd emoji, like actually, kind of thing. But it doesn't just start with like Luther, you know, like pops up in Germany and is like, you know, Pope and Catholic Church bad, starting my own church. Here's the 95 Theses, like there it is. It goes back like way further with events like the Waldensian movement, Albigensian Crusade, Avignon and Papacy, Western Schism, and like the spread of the Black Death. There's a lot of events that kind of like lead up to Luther. And if it wasn't Luther, it was probably going to be somebody else, because there was, at this time, a lot of tension within the Catholic Church. So, the Waldensians are kind of like an early... I don't know if I would say they're a proto-Protestant group. You could argue that, I think. The Waldensians and the Cathars, kind of found in the early and 12th and 13th century in Italy and southern France, are these movements that are looking at the Catholic Church and are kind of getting, you know, a little concerned with the state of the church, especially specifically with the clergy, and how they're noticing how a lot more wealth is being flaunted within the clergy. A lot of ascetical practices are not being adhered to, and so these movements form where there's this kind of desire to go back to the early church, basically. That's where all of this arises from. Everyone's wanting to get back to the early church. So the Waldensians and the Cathars are essentially going to try and recreate the community that the apostles set up, as described in the book of Acts. They're going to focus mainly on communal living and self-imposed poverty. Yeah, so both kind of focusing on poverty as a prerequisite for devotional life, while also restricting the strict hierarchy that's been set up by the Catholic Church in this time. Because of this, like later on, some people are gonna kind of like attribute them to being anarchists in sort of a way. I'm not sure I would go that far. They're more kind of just like an extreme version of like monasticism, essentially. But just like placing themselves outside of the church, which is gonna that's the thing that brings them into conflict with the Catholic Church. Not really the whole self-imposed poverty and all that. It's once they kind of start setting themselves up against the authority of the church is when they start getting into trouble. So there's that. The Avignon Papacy and the Western Schism are going to be another big factor leading up to the Reformation. Mainly because it's going to call into question like the authority of the Pope, who even is the Pope, who is in charge of actually declaring the Pope, like the question of like who's actually the authority within the church is going to come into question when it was kind of taken for granted previously. So during the start of the 14th century, sometime around 1303, Boniface VIII had excommunicated the French king Philip IV for rejecting the Pope's claim of superiority over kings, and I forget which document it was. I don't think it's Exsurge Domine. I think that's something that comes later. But essentially Philip IV and Boniface are having this back and forth where Philip is wanting Boniface to help him fund this war that he has with England. Pope's denying him. Essentially, like they have this whole back and forth, and what ends up happening is some of Philip's allies are actually going to kidnap the Pope and beat him to kind of like, intimidate him to like put him in line with Philip. He's later going to die from his wounds, I believe, and then be succeeded by a Pope who is more in, or he's going to be succeeded by a bishop that's like more in line with Philip, and he's going to be seated in Avignon as well, like a couple of popes following him. As you can imagine, like the Italians really don't like this, and the rest of Europe is kind of looking at this like, noticing like, hey, there's something weird's going on here. Like last pope kind of died under mysterious circumstances. They got the CK2 pop up that this guy's been missing for a while, and then this other guy who just so happens to be in line with Philip is taking his place, along with like 4 other guys who also happen to be really, really strongly allied with France. So you're gonna get a bunch of these other people claiming to be the actual pope. Everyone else is an anti-pope, and it leads to this decades-long struggle to like between all these popes to like claim legitimacy over the entirety of the church. There's even going to be a period of time around, I think, 1378, where there's at least 3 popes at the same time. So on the ground, like, you can kind of imagine if you're just some peasant, which you could argue, like if you're a peasant, like during these times, you probably don't even know the name of the current pope, so it doesn't really matter. But like if you're just on the ground and you get into conversation with someone who's like out traveling, and they mention a pope like different from like the one that you know, yeah, there's gonna be some like thoughts running through your head, like, wait a minute. It's like, okay, wait, who's actually in charge? Like, what are we doing here? Sure hope this lecture mentions Lollardry. I don't think I included Lollardry too much. I didn't even include the English Reformation too much, because I kind of see that as a related but kind of separate event that could have its own full discussion. We're mainly just going to be talking about like the mainland of Europe, not so much of England. And I think most people know about the Anglican Reformation, at least the basics of it. To not include like a whole bunch of discussion on it. Excuse me. So you got all these movements. The Albigensian Crusade, which is going to be a crusade called against the Cathars, which is the first crusade to actually be called against like another group professing to be Christians. That's another thing that stands out about the Albigensian Crusade. Funnily enough, I think the date could be set back a little bit beforehand, because I do think it was declared like a little bit before the Fourth Crusade, but like officially, the Cathars are going to be the first, even though they are like a heretical group, it's going to be the first group of people like professing Christianity to have like some form of Christianity to have a crusade call on them. So it's kind of setting up this precedent that we're going to see later for a bunch of the religious violence that's going to come out of the Reformation. So while all this is going on, also, the bubonic plague, of course, is like sweeping over Europe. Wipes out about half the population, including a lot of the clergy. Some higher clergy, like bishops and those who could afford to essentially quarantine themselves off, are going to survive. But like, if we're talking about just like, you know, your local priest, a lot of them are going to, you know, die in the sweep of the plague. So Catholic Church is also going to have this problem of we've just lost a ton of our employees, basically, and we got to fill these spots up. So you get this like incredible decrease of population, but like this high demand to like fill back these empty roles in the church. And in some cases, they're gonna have to like essentially scrape the barrel and just find anyone just to have like, you know, a warm body like filling up the pulpit. So in some cases, you're gonna get like some not great priests who don't have the best education, which even then, like at this time, you don't really have seminaries, so having you're essentially like beforehand, your priest is basically gonna learn Latin from having an apprenticeship, essentially with like his prior priest. You're not going through like, you're not learning theology, essentially. You're, you know, performing daily tasks to help out at the church, and essentially kind of observing your mentor, as it were. But now, in some cases, you're just gonna like maybe learn like a few of the Gospels. Like maybe your local church has like a copy of Matthew in Latin. It's like, learn this, and you're good to go, essentially. So that's also going to kind of be a major cause of Luther and the other reformers' issues with the church and the education that's kind of been given to some priests. While you have that going on, with the higher up on the rung with the clergy, as kind of mentioned with like the Waldensians and the Cathars, you're getting a lot of bishops and popes kind of being brought up at this time who are either relatives or just directly related to a lot of nobility or wealthy merchants. I believe that I think a Medici at one point was the Pope, and then of course you have like the Borgia family having like that whole affair. But I do think a Medici at some point the Borgia at some point either have like a bunch of cardinals sitting in Rome or getting to become Pope at some point. But it's mostly like those clergy that are going to have like any form of actual quality education, whereas like on the ground, like your local priest is not going to have, you know, as much education. There was a Medici Pope. Yeah, I might have included like a little footnote for him, but I can't remember exactly at the moment who it was. So right here I have like a little quote from like a historian that's kind of I think it was this was an anonymous letter in, I believe, Germany. with a layman kind of like laying out his problems with like the current state of the church. So the priesthood includes innumerable contemptible persons of abject life, utterly unworthy in learning and morals, from whose execrable lives and pernicious ignorance infinite scandals arise. The church sacraments are despised by the laity, and in very many districts the layfolk hold the priests as vile. So you're either, at this time, like, of course there are going to be, like, you know, a handful of, like, or more than a handful of, like, good priests, like, good people, but, like, the general sentiment around this time is either our priests are uneducated, they aren't very well learned in theology, or just they are straight up, like, almost flaunting their immorality and wealth in some cases. You are going to have a lot of priests in this time kind of have, like, open affairs, basically. Which we'll talk about, like, Luther's visit to Rome. I think his visit to Rome was kind of like the actual starting point for his kind of desire to reform. So the first, like, direct line between Luther and the past here, the past century here, is going to be Jan Hus, which Luther himself is going to personally reference during the Diet of Worms, whenever we get to that, claiming to be a follower of this guy. So Jan Hus is going to be born sometime around the mid-1370s. We don't exactly know when or... What's the little sex between papal pals? Yeah, exactly. The Borgias especially are a very bad case of that, if you want to read into the scandal at this time. If you think, like, the current Pope has his fill of controversies, go read up on the Borgias. They're interesting. You could do, like, a whole, like, HBO miniseries about them, or, you know, make a video game series about assassinating them, but hey, who would do that? Both based and base. So Jan Hus is going to be born. All we know basically is he's born sometime in the 1370s. Don't know his parents. Don't really know the economic background of his parents, whether they're peasants or hireborns. Which he could have been, at the very least, his parents probably were some form of, like, wealthier lower class, maybe, because he is able to get an education. Wealthier lower class, maybe, like, lower nobility at the very least. But he's going to be born in the eastern region of Bohemia within the Holy Roman Empire, so he is ethnically he is Czech, and he, to this day, he kind of is seen as, like, a nationalist Czech figure, which a lot of the Reformation is kind of gonna essentially come down to, like, a growth of, like, nationalistic feelings in some regions of Europe, alongside this kind of, like, anti-papacy sentiment. So, yeah, we don't know his exact background. He's going to be sent to a monastery at the age of 10 to receive a basic education, which isn't very odd at this time for young boys. Again, at this time, you don't have, like, a formal, primary and secondary education system set up in Europe, so most young boys are sent off to monasteries to get, like, a basic education in reading, usually Latin or Greek, something like that. Sometimes in the lingua franca of the area, occasionally. Most of the times it's parents sending kids off to, like, get an education so they can go into more profitable forms of work. Like Luther, for instance, is going to be sent off to a monastery to, get a basic education and then like later try and become a lawyer. That's gonna get like a wrench thrown into it later. Same thing with Hus. Gonna get a basic education at a monastery. Later on, he's gonna move to get his secondary education at the University of Prague. He will become a professor of philosophy 1398, so kind of like in his late 20s. A lot of these people, like, you're gonna kind of feel gonna kind of make you feel bad for not becoming, like the dean of a department in a university by like your mid to late 20s. Weirdly enough, a lot of these guys accomplished a whole lot early on in life. He's gonna be again made dean a few years later, ordained as a priest in 1402. It's his time at the university where most historians kind of think he starts to get his anti-papal sentiments from some of his co-workers there. Mostly because of the Avignon papacy controversy and the Western Schism, and also the selling of indulgences that were being practiced by anti-pope John the 23rd. So that's going to come up again. That's kind of a direct link to Luther here. For Jan Hus, a lot of his inspiration is going to both come mainly just from the events going on at the time and all those controversies, and also from John Wycliffe. I don't have a slide about him, no. But they're essentially going to share a lot of similar ideas. John Wycliffe is going to be based over in England, and he's essentially going to be writing also about the current controversies in the church at the time. Wycliffe is kind of the first proposer of, I don't want to say sola scriptura because he doesn't really, I don't believe he formulates it exactly in the same way as Martin Luther, but he's essentially going to be the first person, the first major figure to kind of put forward this idea that as the church we don't need this strict hierarchy or this single person to serve as the sole establisher of doctrine and practice. Instead, he's saying what we need to do is just, look to the scriptures as the only source of authority in the church. And that's gonna be like the major thing, like kicking off the Reformation, like 100 years beforehand, and it's just gonna keep going from here. Yeah, so a few of the other things Wycliffe is going to kind of attack in his writings include monasticism. He's not a fan of that. He kind of sees it as like a waste of time, essentially. Saying that instead of, sequestering yourself away in a monastery, you would do better off in being actively out in the world, interacting with people, and helping to spread the gospel. He's going to attack the papacy and the overall hierarchy of the church. He's also going to, weirdly enough, 100 years before Luther, reject transubstantiation, which Jan Hus is not going to accept that part, which this thing is is kind of weird. It's gonna remain dormant for about 100 years, and then appear up with Martin Luther, which we'll talk about. If you're not aware of what transubstantiation is, we'll kind of get into that a little bit later. Wycliffe is also going to reject the sacrament of confession. Again, kind of the first one to put forward the Protestant idea of that it's unnecessary to have any kind of mediator for a layperson and God. In the sense of confession, you don't need to tell it to a priest, so therefore it's unnecessary to even have the sacrament in the first place as it stands. And also sola fide, so saved by grace alone, rather than works. So for Jan Hus, mostly what he's going to take away from Wycliffe. He's going to reject a couple of his ideas. The big ones, though, are he's going to accept the primacy of Scripture as the sole authority of doctrine and dogma, and that's kind of the major thing he goes with, and he's going to be opponent of papal infallibility. He would hold some Catholic adjacent views, though. For instance, some of his sermons, he lambasts priests who don't uphold their vows of celibacy, rather than like just attacking the idea of celibate priests altogether. That's not really a problem for him. And so again, he's just focused on like, you know, you've taken these vows, you should, if you are serious about these vows that you've taken as a priest, like you should be beholden to them, rather than what a lot of reformers will do in the future, just kind of, you know, throwing the baby out with the bathwater, essentially, in some cases. He is also going to hold into high regard. He does put forward sola scriptura as like his main doctrine, but at the same time he's still going to honor some of the church fathers and the teachings from some saints like Saint Augustine, Gregory the Great, Thomas Aquinas, and some local Bohemian saints like Wenceslaus, Albert, and Ludmilla, and still hold the doctors and fathers of the church in high regard. So he's not exactly going with, you know, within some Protestant circles you have the idea of like the clergy of every believer. He's not necessarily going to accept that. He is going to like hold on to some kind of authority with, you know, older church elders, but they're to a lesser degree than Scripture. So again, his colleagues and his support for Wycliffe and his writings are going to cause him to be excommunicated under a papal bull issued by Alexander V in 1409. Later on, at some point, I believe a few years after this, like maybe one or two, there's going to be at least 3 peasant supporters within Prague who are going to publicly espouse the anti-indulgence stances that Hus was talking about in the university, and they're actually going to be beheaded for this, caught by the authorities, you know, held on a ecclesiastical trial, and, you know, executed for it. Following this, Wycliffe, all writings from John Wycliffe within the city are going to be collected and burned within the town square, and all his teachings are going to be forbidden by law. So, because of all of his stances that he at some point is going to make public, there's a couple of other things that he kind of does. In some of his sermons, which you actually kind of you can actually go on the Internet Archive and like look up a collection of his works. Some of his sermons are actually also going to include little bits of support for an idea of Czech separatism, actually, which I think that's kind of going to be like one of the last straws that gets him, that gets a essentially a crusade called on him as supporters later on, because, you know, that's kind of a straight up threat to the unity of the Holy Roman Empire at this point, which is interesting. He's for a lot of those sermons, he's going to kind of be declared a national hero later on. He also has some pro-Donatist stances as well, which essentially is an older church heresy dating from around, this is early 300s, I believe. Essentially, like, some of his Donatist stances were, if you have a priest who is actively living within sin, any sacrament that he provides to his church are essentially null and void. And that until he commits some act of penance or repentance, he's not fit to serve, the Eucharist, baptize, anything like that. So he's got that. His support of Wycliffe and anti-papal sentiments are going to cause him to be called by the, I believe... Okay, so no, not the king of... Okay. He's going to get called by the king of Bohemia, Sigismund of Hungary, who, I believe he's the brother of the emperor at the time. Yes, he's the brother of the emperor at the time. To a council held in the city of Constance. The council is going to be called in 1414, and Sigismund at that point, he's really concerned about all the stuff he's hearing for the unity of the church and the empire. He's worried that this is going to essentially break out into a civil war where Bohemia is going to try and declare independence from the empire. So he's going to call this council to try and peaceably get things sorted out. Hopefully to find some sort of compromise between Hus and some of his followers, and to keep that from happening. During this time, he's actually going to promise Jan Hus safe conduct, being transferred to the city of Constance, and while he is in the city, is going to ensure that he is protected and guarded. Kind of showing that he is genuine about trying to keep the peace during this, but he gives him the stipulation that while he's under his protection, he's not allowed to preach or publicly speak outside of the council while it's being held within the city. Jan Hus is not going to agree to those terms. He's going to continue to preach while he's in the city, and his opponents are essentially going to use that opportunity to arrest him in that case. He's going to be taken out of the city and transferred to a Franciscan monastery and put on trial there. When he's asked to recant his positions that the church deemed heretical, he stated that he would only agree to do so if he was convinced of his errors on a scriptural basis. And throughout this whole trial is essentially going to decline to recant any of his stances in this case. So, in the final day of this trial, June 8th, 1415, again, he's going to be asked to recall all of his anti-papal sentiments and pro-Wycliffe statements. He's going to refuse. At this point, he's going to be stripped of all his priestly ornaments and robes, vestments. His tonsure is going to be removed. And a tall paper hat is going to be placed on his head, if you guys know, the little, paper dunce cap. That's, same thing here, except it's going to be, what is written on the hat is, make sure I pronounce this correctly, Heresy Archaea, or Arch Heretic, essentially. He's going to be led to a stake and burned alive. He got put in the he got a little more than put in the timeout corner. He's going to be led to a stake and burned alive. And his ashes are going to be scattered throughout the Rhine because they were worried that he was later going to be venerated as a saint, and they didn't want to, they didn't want to let his followers have any kind of relics to venerate. So a little more than just the timeout corner. And supposedly during this time, while he's being burned at the stake, he's going to utter the words, utter his final words, which supposedly were, "You may kill a weak goose," which is what Huss in Czech means. "You may kill a weak goose, but more powerful birds, eagles and falcons, will come after me," which Martin Luther later on is going to interpret to mean himself and his followers. So, some of the other beliefs that I've pulled up here for Huss's beliefs that you've probably read over are, which we can go over some of these because I think I should explain some of these. So, supreme authority of the scriptures is pretty self-explanatory. The opposition to plenary indulgences. So we could probably get this out of the way right now. So what an indulgence essentially is, I might get some of this wrong because, spoiler, I'm not Catholic, and the Orthodox don't really have the idea of indulgences that the Roman Catholics do, but from my understanding, a plenary indulgence it's not what some people might interpret to be like a paid ticket to heaven. Essentially, that's not what it is. What a plenary indulgence is it is any kind of spiritual action that you can take that's been approved by a priest of some kind to you to reduce your time in purgatory. So there's two kinds of indulgences. There's temporal or temporary indulgences and plenary indulgences. Plenary indulgences are big ones. These weren't given out, Monopoly get out of jail free card. Kind of, essentially. So it's to reduce your time in purgatory, and a plenary indulgence is the big one. It's this is some kind of act that is really big, and it reduces a large amount of time that you would normally spend in purgatory, preparing to enter heaven. So it's not like you're gonna go to hell without this indulgence. It's just to reduce your time spent in the fires of purgatory, which are made to cleanse you before entering heaven. The temporal indulgences are for temporary punishments for sin, so stuff that you would normally experience in this life on earth rather than in purgatory. I'll have a little question segment later on, if any of you guys need me to clarify on anything as much as I understand it, or if you need me to stop during slides, feel free to highlight your message so I can kind of stop for a moment and talk about it. Blatant corruption in the church, we can talk about that. The translating and preaching of the Bible in vernacular languages. So, as far as I understand it, when it comes to the translation of the Bible into vernacular languages, the reason the Catholic Church at this time was kind of very strict about this is one, at this time, Latin is going to be considered essentially a sanctified language. But also the Vulgate, the Latin Bible, which had been composed around, make sure I get this right. Yeah, 382, which had been compiled by St. Jerome. They're going to hold that the Vulgate is the most accurate translation, and they're trying to be careful with cases of mistranslation. So anyone who wants to translate a new edition of the Bible essentially has to get approved first. But it's this long and really arduous process where you have to go essentially up the managerial. It's going up the managerial ladder of getting approval, and you just get stuck in bureaucratical hell. And so most reformers at this point, or later on, who do translate the Bible, are just going to skip that and kind of get in trouble for it, but they kind of don't really have too much of a choice, because it's either do that or just never translate it. Protestantism. Okay, let's see. Receiving communion in both kinds. This is a weird one for me when I found this out, because it's weirdly enough an Orthodox position for Jan Hus. A lot of these pop up, which is really weird, because like when I was like reading through this, I was like, huh, that's like interesting. Which there was a little bit of dialogue between Luther and some of the patriarchs in Constantinople, but they didn't really go anywhere. So, the receiving of communion in both kinds, I didn't get a chance to really look into this too much. I can't remember exactly the doctrinal reasoning why the Catholic Church only does communion in one kinds. Especially in this time period, the doctrine of the Catholic Church in the medieval era and today are very different, so you can't really conflate the two in a lot of cases. But essentially, like, what this means is, so with communion, you know, so you got the bread and the wine. At this time, the Catholic Church is only giving the bread to the lay people, or, you know, people who aren't priests, who are coming up for communion. Which is, like, if you've seen, like, Catholic services, like, you can see this still, where, you know, they just get the little communion wafers, and that's it, no wine. Jan Hus, because he is going to be holding to Sola Scriptura, is going to himself interpret the passage, you know, this is my body, this is my blood broken and given for all. He's going to say, well, okay, we need to, like, have communion of both kinds, so we need to give everybody bread and wine. And that's, again, going to be like another thing that kind of gets him in trouble. Alright, so after Jan Hus dies, there's still going to be a lot of tension within the Empire after this. He's kind of garnered a lot of supporters, like, throughout his time in the University of Prague and while preaching. A lot of people in Bohemia really like his pro-Czech sentiment, and are kind of wanting, like, essentially self-rule at this point. So 4 years after his death, tensions are going to start to, like, kind of boil over a little bit. Sigismund, after condemning Jan Hus to death, is going to send out letters across Bohemia threatening all followers of Jan Hus and John Wycliffe, threatening to drown them, essentially. Yes, war wagon. We'll get to the war wagons here. That's a really, I love the Hussite war wagons. These letters are, instead of suppressing his followers, are only going to, like, embolden them. So what's going to happen is, across Bohemia, the Hussites are, they've already kind of broken up into factions at this point. Because Jan Hus has died, there's, like, kind of a fracturing of unity and ideas. There's a bunch of different leaders popping up, and, you know, because he's dead, he can't, like, essentially reel them all in under his authority at this point. There's going to be those who are more, I don't know if I'd call it, if, like, literalist is, like, the correct word for it, but it's essentially, like, the group that's going to only follow what is explicitly in Jan Hus's writings and teachings are going to be called the Utraquists, which means of both kinds. So those, you know, they have a banner of the communion chalice as their symbol. So the ones, you know, championing, you know, like, we want bread and wine in the communion both, are going to be the majority faction, and they're more moderate than most of the other ones that are going to pop up here. The only major difference that they're going to hold against the Catholic Church is, again, like, they want communion with, like, both bread and wine. Other than that, they're still fairly Catholic. There's not, like, a whole lot separating them in that case. Another faction, the second big faction. There's going to be a bunch of other ones. I couldn't find a lot of info on them though. But the second major faction is going to be the Taborites, getting their name from like the town of Tabor in Bohemia, are much more militant. And I have written here more anarchistic in nature, because they are like much more against like any kind of church hierarchy. Like they want none whatsoever. I think they even called for an abolition of property in some of their letters and writings. I think with the Taborites, it is more accurate to just straight up call them anarchists. And they are going to be led, again, I would argue this guy's like much more of like a big nationalist figure than Jan Hus. Jan Žižka, who is he wasn't a knight. He wasn't a knight. He was he was a war veteran who essentially like helped gather up like a bunch of peasants to like form like these large rebel armies within the region. So throughout Bohemia, there's going to be large Hussite populations who are going to start expelling Catholic priests out of like major cities in retaliation for killing Jan Hus. The most extreme case of this is going to happen on the 30th of July in 1419, when Jan Zilewski and a group of Hussites are going to walk to the town hall of Prague and go up to the third story of the town hall, take the Burgermeister, a couple of the town councilors, and the king's representatives, and throw them out the window. And this is going to later be named as the first defenestration of Prague, which defenestration is like the act of killing someone by throwing them out a window. I don't think necessarily killing someone by throwing them out a window. I think it's just like the act of throwing someone out a window. But it's going to end up killing some of the people they throw out, along with like some people walking in the street. So if you like imagine you're just like some Czech guy in like the 1400s just like walking around, you know, strolling about town, you're going to the market to like buy some stuff, and the mayor just crashes on top of your head, breaking your neck, and you're done. So it's starting to pop off very quickly. Here we have the war wagons. So what's going to happen here is, after this, it's going to kick off this like huge event, which like this could have like a whole stream dedicated to this. Like maybe if we play Felvedek, I might do like another stream talking about the Hussite Wars. There are a couple of videos, like whenever I post this up to YouTube, I'll post like a bunch of like the resources that I've used. There's a really good video that I found on some of the battles of the Hussite War, which is really, really well done. But you're gonna have a bunch of these scattered engagements at this point in Bohemia. I think it's actually going to be, I think officially this is considered a crusade on the Catholic side. I think Sigismund, or not Sigismund, I think his brother, which I'm forgetting his name at the moment, Sigismund, I think, is going to actually die from the stress. I think the primary sources like say that he died from shock upon hearing about the defenestration and like the rebellions happening. So his brother's going to take over as the Holy Roman Emperor after he dies, but I forget his name. I think it's Wenceslaus. But anyway, the event's going to spark a series of wars in the region. Surprisingly enough, the rebel army, which is just made up of like a bunch of peasants and like some war veterans, a handful of knights here and there, um, or they're gonna win basically, despite being outnumbered and facing like on paper the better trained, more veteran forces of like the pro-papal side of this war. Mainly because Jan Žižka is going to use like very unorthodox tactics, like as you can see here, with war wagons. This is actually also the first major use of firearms in any kind of European warfare. So like what they do essentially is, this is a really good illustration. So like what they will do is whenever they have a pitched battle, Jan Žižka is going to take like a lot of these peasants who, a lot of them have like a background in like carpentry and like engineering, are going to like reinforce these wagons with these big panels that you can either slant upward or kind of like throw down in this makeshift like fortress basically. And you have these little murder holes, which I forget the actual name for these. You have some of these on like castles, like on inside like walls and like on the very top of like battlements. But these little cutouts to where you can take handguns, crossbows, and shoot out from them. And it's going to be really effective because the pro-papal side is going to be mostly made up of like nobility and knights. So if you've got a lot of people who don't have any kind of armor, and you've got these handguns and crossbows, you don't want to just like set them out on the field, because what will happen is you leave them open to like flanking charges. But with wagons, you can't really run down a wagon with like a horse and a lance. You're just like battering up against a wall. So we'll take these wagons and either, fortify a hill or move around the battlefield and kind of form this either full circle or half circular formation, and just make a castle like in the middle of the field essentially. And this is going to be what helps them, win an outnumbered and outgunned fight. Well, not like outgunned, but help them like beat a superior, like on paper, a superior foe, which is really cool. I love the war wagons so much. And hopefully when Kingdom Come Deliverance 2 comes out, we'll see a little bit of these. But, so with the Hussite Wars, why this is important to talk about with the Reformation 100 years prior is because what this does for a lot of people, including the Reformers, is it shows that it is possible to kind of essentially not break away entirely, because they are going to remain within the Catholic Church, and they are going to negotiate a special dispensation from the papacy that like allows them to still exist but keep their own practices. But essentially the Hussites win, they're able to form their own church essentially. It shows that it's possible to do that. And it's going to later on inspire Martin Luther and a lot of his followers. And a lot of the Hussites are, eventually when Martin Luther comes around, they are going to full on join the Reformation, like when that comes around. Okay. Take a little breath here. So, finally getting on around Martin Luther's time. So here we kind of have illustration of like what the actual area looks like. So Jan Hus will have him like right over here, way far in the east regions of the Holy Roman Empire. Luther is going to show up around the Low Countries, I believe. So like modern day Netherlands. A lot of the reformers who show up in the H area are going to come from like the modern day like Netherlands area. It's like somewhere around here. So still at this time, Roman Catholicism is going to have a monopoly over essentially being the one church in Europe. If you're born in Western Europe, you're going to be Catholic essentially. By this point, the Eastern Roman Empire has fallen to the Ottoman Sultanate, basically making Orthodoxy much more scattered in the region. By this time, like, you know, any kind of like gains they had made like in southern Italy are gone at this point, and they are going to be, for the most part, the majority populations are going to be scattered about like throughout Poland, Lithuania, a little bit in Hungary. You are going to have some refugees moving over here to Wallachia and Hungary in some small amounts, but mostly, you know, in regions of like Novgorod and like what would later become like the Slavic states. You get the height of Thomism and Scholasticism, marking a move away from the mysticism of the early church to a more rationalist approach to theology. Essentially kind of using almost Aristotelian methods in approaching theology. Russian princes are only just peeling pneumatic tribute away. Yeah, basically, yeah. By this time, if you're the Pope, you're a happy guy. Because your rivalry with the Eastern Church is basically like non-existent now. But unfortunately, you have the Ottomans to deal with now. And you can still kind of see even during this time, you can kind of see the leftover of the Fourth Crusade. Venice has its little colonies over in Greece, and you have like some of the little rump states kind of still left over, but not really. Imagine if the papacy still owned Avignon. Oh man. You've also got growing political tensions throughout Europe relating to the church. Again, Avignon papacy. Blatant cases of simony and corruption, which simony, if you're not familiar, is the... Who was it named after exactly? Named after Simon Magus. Yeah. Who essentially tried to pay money to essentially get the same kind of dispensation that the apostles had. But in this case, simony is basically like paying money to get a clerical position within the church, rather than being ordained normally. So basically bribery to become a priest. The representation in the College of Cardinals is going to be a big issue, especially in the northern regions of Europe. A couple of historians claim like the major reason why Protestantism is going to like really kick off in like the regions of like Denmark and Sweden, because a lot of historians argue that like they really don't have any kind of like cultural connections with Italy and the Papal States, and they don't get a lot of representation in the College of Cardinals, so the kings are gonna like benefit a lot from like not having to pay the tithe and essentially like form state-backed churches. The same thing with England, really, just on like an earlier and larger scale. And growing nationalist sentiment, which we saw in Bohemia, and priests holding both religious and secular seats of power is going to be another major thing. In the HRE, you will have cases with prince bishops becoming really a regular occurrence. So, like the bishop in charge of like your region of the church could also just be like the head of the secular state. It would be like in... what would be a good comparison to this? It would be like if, let's say like for the sake of argument, like America, for whatever reason, is like like Catholic, like completely, and you have like the president is like also the Archbishop of America. It's like a really weird situation. I don't know if like that's a good comparison or not, but it's like you're essentially paying double taxes to the same guy with the tithe and secular taxes. All right, I'm actually gonna grab some water here because my throat is getting a little sore here. This will take like a very... Maybe I throw up the BRB screen real quick here, and I will be right back. Okay. Do I have any questions, by the way? Oh, I've already been going for an hour? I feel like I've been like rambling through this really fast. I also tell I'm kind of nervous a little bit. I don't know why. Imagine if the governor of your state was everyone's lawyer who needed to be on tap. Yeah, no, it's a really weird situation. I think it doesn't start around that time, but it's more common. I think during like the very inception of the Holy Roman Empire, you do have some cases of prince bishops because they're essentially recreating the governmental structure of the Roman Empire, but just like through the structure of the church. Questions for me? All right. So getting a little closer to Martin Luther here. Slowly but surely. So, outside of Jan Hus, this guy right here, Desiderius Erasmus, is going to be the... Erasmus got that 1920s Coca-Cola eyes. I think he did. He had the propensity to. He did drink a whole lot, from what I've read. I would argue Erasmus is a little bit more of a larger influence on Martin Luther. Luther was kind of like a big, well, for a little bit, which we'll kind of get into later. For a time, he was like a big Erasmus fanboy. But later had a falling out with him when Erasmus wouldn't completely join the Reformation. He kind of had like a never meet your heroes moment. And kind of had like a parasocial meltdown. That didn't happen. I think he called him a viper at some point after Erasmus like wouldn't join the Reformation. He kind of took like a very moderate stance, like remain Catholic, but like we'll get into it. Okay, so Erasmus is he's a very influential writer around this time. He's really popular with a lot of more educated princes within the regions of like England, the Netherlands, and northern Germany. He's mostly going to be writing satire around this time, talking about and criticizing kind of like everything that's been going on within Europe politically, both secular and within the church at this time. If we have time, I can go over like one of his writings, because one of them, there's one that I found that was really funny. I kind of liked it. So he's going to be born to a Dutch priest. So he's an illegitimate child, first off. This guy's really interesting. So he's an illegitimate child of a Dutch priest and the daughter of a doctor, and he's going to be born in 1466. For a while, he's going to kind of be kept a secret. Later on, it's kind of an open secret, but like his parents are never legally or officially married, but he's, going to remain at home and live relatively normally as a child. He's going to be sent to a monastery again at an early age to receive a basic education. During his 20s, he's going to be alive during another sweep of the bubonic plague, which is going to kill like 20 of his fellow classmates, along with a monk who was teaching them, I think. Both his parents will also die, like, to the same sweep of the plague. And this is going to send Erasmus into like years worth of life in poverty. And I think early on, this is kind of like a big factor into like his kind of very like cynical outlook on life, which kind of comes through his writing. He's a really... I started off, when I started reading about Erasmus, I kind of wasn't like a big fan of him, because he's kind of a little snarky and he comes off as a bit of an asshole, to be honest, but it's understandable, for someone to have gone through that. He kind of gets a pass on that. To avoid essentially like living on the streets, he's instead going to like become a monk at an Augustinian order up in Holland, which is still like is somewhat aesthetic living, but it's like better than being a beggar on the street. He was the Rick and Morty of the 15th and 16th century. I don't know if I'd go that far. He's not that insufferable. He's got like some naive views on like how he thinks the state should be run, but aside from that, like, he gets a pass. He gets a pass on kind of like coming off as like an asshole. He's a little more highbrow than Rick and Morty. I'll say that. So because he essentially is joining like a monastery like with not much choice. It takes a very high IQ to understand Erasmus. He's not really he becomes like he kind of resents the idea of monasticism, because he's kind of been thrust into it with not much of a choice, either like spend his life as a beggar or go into the monastery. He suffered from gallstones, so the very strict diet and fasting he was not a big fan of, and he would kind of like criticize it earlier. He drank a lot of wine during this time because there's a couple of like medieval medical codexes around this time where their treatment for gallstones was to drink a lot of wine. so he kind of became somewhat of an alcoholic, just a little bit. But his writings are going to focus a lot on issues of like humanistic philosophy, the state of the church, and satire. One of his most famous works, his most popular one, which earns him a lot of money and patronage from like a lot of nobility, is going to be the book In Praise of Folly, which is going to become like a bestseller at this time. I think it sells like 3,000 copies, which like doesn't sound like a lot, but like at the time, when you have like minimal literacy in Europe, that's like really big. If only doctors would prescribe heavy drinking today. Oh, what was the 1890s cough drops? It had like bits of cocaine and like heroin and a bunch of other stuff in it. It's like, here, take a tablespoon of this before you go to sleep. You won't even remember taking it. Make your cough go right. You won't even notice your cough. If you got like a strong stomach, I would really recommend looking up some medical codexes from like around Reformation, late medieval Europe. They're a wild ride. Guarantee those cough drops are more effective than modern ones. Yeah, you don't notice your cough because it'll knock you right out. Oh man. So in his so In Praise of Folly, it's this huge book, and you can look this up on like the Internet Archive. I read through like the introduction. Honestly, like I should spend more time like reading it because I couldn't really get into it. But I've read through the introduction at least. But the book is told through the first-person view of Folly or Foolishness, who's been personified, and she's basically throughout the whole book like patting herself on the back, praising herself for the madness, delusion, and corruption she has caused like throughout Europe and the church, and just kind of like bragging about like all the problems going on as like a way of like kind of comedically, criticizing the state of the church at the time. The one tract that I did read from Erasmus in full, like researching this, is one that he wrote initially anonymously, and it's called Julius Excluded from Heaven. And it is a short comedic tract in which he writes a situation where Pope Julius II, who's sometimes called the Warrior Pope, who engaged in like a lot of warfare in Europe at the time to expand the Papal States, he dies, and he wakes up with his personification of his own genius with him. He wakes up at the gates of heaven, and he is denied entry into heaven by St. Peter, and he starts this argument by asking, like who the hell even are you? Like, let me in, or I'm going to excommunicate you. Let me pull it up so I can like read a few passages from it. What was the one line that like killed me? Okay, so here we have Julius after waking up, and he can't open the doors, and he's like, someone must have changed the lock, or the lock is broken. He says, now I'm getting really mad, I'll knock the doors down. Somebody come and open this door right away. What's the hang-up? Nobody home? What's the matter with the doorman? He's asleep, I guess, or else drunk. Peter, a good thing our gates are of adamant, otherwise this one, whoever he is, would have kicked them in. He must be a giant of some sort, a general of the armies, a stormer of cities. But oh my god, what a sewer stench is this? I certainly won't open the gates right away, but take a seat up here by a grated window where I can look out and keep an eye on the scene. Who are you, and what do you want? Julius? Open the door, will you, at least if you can. If you were really doing your job, it should have been opened long ago and decorated with all the heraldry of heaven. Peter, in response, pretty lordly, but first tell me who you are. Julius, as if you couldn't see it for yourself. But if you're not stone blind, you're bound to recognize this key, even if you aren't familiar with the golden oak tree. You can certainly see my triple crown, as well my cloak all gleaming with golden gems. So, this goes on for like a little bit. And he finds the line where he threatens to excommunicate him. Okay, this one's pretty good. Julius, why don't you stop all this nonsense and open the doors? Perhaps you'd rather I broke them. Why do we need all this palaver? You see the sort of troops I have at my command. Peter, I do indeed see some highly practiced thieves, but you must be aware that these doors can only be opened in other ways. Julius, enough words, I say. If you don't hurry up and open the gates, I'll unleash my thunderbolts of excommunication, with which I used to terrify great kings on earth and their kingdoms too. You see, I've already got a bull prepared for the occasion. So, really, I kind of like some of Erasmus's writings. He's a little rough around the edges, but I ended up liking him. The one thing I didn't like when researching him is his idea of he wanted the state to run the churches, and like essentially wanted a kind of like a Thomas More style of oh my god, I'm blanking. It's like a Thomas More style utopia, where the kings and princes are like the priors of a monastery, and everyone within the state is a monk, essentially, which is like, okay. It's like, alright, buddy. So, some other things here. He's going to be ordained almost proto-totalitarianism. Yeah, he is very, like, very high opinion of, like, the secular princes and state. Which at this time, I think is a little, or at any time really, is a little bit naive of him. For as cynical as he was in some cases, like, very optimistic about other things. He's going to be ordained as a priest at 25, but he's not going to serve actively because he is going to get a special dispensation from his bishop because of his health problems. So throughout the rest of his life, he's technically ordained, and like at any time he could serve a mass if he either wanted to or was required. But he's not really going to do that. Most of the time, he's I put here, like, he's gonna travel a whole lot and live extravagantly. I don't think I'd probably get rid of, like, him living extravagantly. He's gonna be provided donations by, like, wealthy benefactors, but, like, it's for book sales, so it's not, like, a regular source of income. It's more like he's getting, like, a lot of cash all at once, but, like, he's not able to, like, you know, stand around in, like, one place for too long, so he's having to move a whole lot. So he has, like, a regular income, but he's not, like, you know, living like royalty. Who would have thought alcoholism gives one lane? Hey man, a lot of the best writers either are alcoholics, kind of crazy, or on some sort of drugs, so you know, adversity, you know, makes for good artists. He's also going to, again, like, avoid monastic living for most of his life, stating that, like, the diet would kill him, which at first to me sounded like um, hyperbole, but probably was true to some extent. So yeah, you can see like he's moving around a lot, um, hanging out with like a bunch of princes from like England, France, and the lowlands in Germany. So he's going to be really critical of the church, but he's never going to outright renounce Catholicism. If anything, like Erasmus is probably like the title reformer, like given to the most reformers, like isn't really accurate because they end up just like breaking off from the church completely. Erasmus is pretty much like the only like actual full on guy who is like calling just for reform in the Catholic Church throughout this time. He's not calling for like any breakoffs. He's just wanting the church to kind of like fix itself and get its stuff together. Really, um, he's going to defend Catholic dogma and speak highly of the sacraments. He just wants like all the corruption to like get thrown out, basically. The only thing, again, he's going to like really attack is like kind of criticizing the modern state of monasticism, which, I mean, even like my namesake in his time in like 762 Bede is going to like complain about the state of monasticism, which is kind of funny. Essentially it's going to be this thing where it's like you guys have it too easy. You guys have it too easy. You're not real monastics. You're not like going out into the deserts of central Germany, and living off the land, stuff like that. Which at this point, like, even then, being a monastic in Central Europe is like going to look it looked very different, like in the 800s, than it did like in the Middle East. if you're a monk like in Western Europe, like you kind of do have it a little bit easier than let's say the Desert Fathers, or like someone like Anthony the Great in Alexandria. Like just because of like the resources around, you're gonna have it a little easier, like regardless. But I mean, at this time, like most monasteries and priories, like are either going to be located like fairly close to most high population centers, or even have like their own small holdings. Like there are going to be some priests that like preside over monasteries that are going to own like little fiefdoms at this point, and have like a couple of like peasant farmlands surrounding them. But like mostly like what he criticized on monasticism, which like is like kind of interesting. He viewed monasticism as something that like all Christians should aspire to, but it like shouldn't be its own separate thing. Like his ideal, again, is like this Thomas More utopia where like everyone's basically living in like this state sanctioned like state-sized monastery, with like the princes and kings being the priors and everyone's like being a monk. Maybe the Irish monks can get a pass because Ireland is basically perpetually moss-covered rock. The Irish, like, which I want to do some writing on the Irish monks. The Irish monks actually have a lot of traditions taken from the Alexandrian hermits, and like kind of really faithfully carried them out, which is really interesting. I like the Irish monks a whole lot. But in one of his writings, like when talking about this, he said, "Why do we limit the profession of Christ, which he wished to extend most widely? I beseech you, what else is a city but a great monastery?" Referencing there the passages of Christ fasting and spending like 40 days in the desert, That's like his, you know, passage for supporting monasticism, basically. My battery on my laptop is dying. And then kind of looked on the outward ceremony of the church and like pushed for more inward devotion of the faith. Like, not wanting to get rid of like the ceremony, but like he didn't like the almost overemphasis on the outward practices. Okay. We're almost 2 hours in, we finally get to Martin Luther. So, let's see. I'll move some of these slides around so I'm having fun with this. Okay, yeah, 2 hours in, finally we get to Martin Luther. So, Luther is going to be born in 1483, 120 years after Jan Hus and the Hussite Wars. So, but we'll see. We'll hopefully kind of illustrate like why it was kind of important to talk about the Hussite Wars. He is going to like essentially like pick up their torch that they have left like a century prior to himself. He starts out fairly similar, with a similar upbringing to Erasmus, minus like being the illegitimate child of a priest. He is going to be born to a peasant family, but like raised in like a wealthier peasant family, which I'll kind of like briefly mention when we get to like the short overview of the HRE. There's a lot of historians that like kind of point to the Reformation. The HRE is like the early beginnings of capitalism, because around this time you get like a lot of like upward movement because of the Black Death and the decrease in population. A lot of peasants are kind of like able to negotiate better wages and living conditions for themselves with their lords, because the demand for labor is like so high and like the supply is like gotten so low. A lot of free cities within the HRE are getting like backed by like independent merchant families. And in the case of like Martin Luther, his father is going to start out as just like a worker in a mine, but then later on move up to be a I think he becomes the overseer of an entire mine. So, you know, he gets like this massive increase in pay relative to like what a regular peasant family would have at the time. And his father is going to like kind of encourage Luther to like carry that on by sending him off to get an education to become a lawyer. That is initially like what the plan for Luther's future was going to be, rather than a priest. That changes though when, if only Germany was still this decentralized, if only. Real and true. This is gonna change though when like one day Luther's coming back from the university that he's studying at, and he gets caught in like this really bad storm and is nearly struck by lightning. And he's going to pray to Saint Anne, who is the patron saint of miners, and oddly enough, the patron saint of protecting those who are caught in storms. It's kind of funny how that worked out for him. But he's going to pray for the intercession of Saint Anne, and promises that if he survives this storm, he will become a monk, which he survives, and he is going to become a monk, much to the great disappointment of his father. His father's going to be furious at this, and like they aren't going to be really on good speaking terms at this time, going forward. I think during Luther's first mass, he actually goes back to his hometown and kind of has like an emotional breakdown because his father is there, and there's this whole like kind of Freudian psychological thing you can go into with like Luther's problems with like the Roman Catholic Church and like his relationship with his father. We're not gonna get into that, but like that's an interesting rabbit hole you can go down. Sometimes it feels like saints are given domains via darts. Sometimes, yeah, but most of the time, like, it's relating to like the story of their life. But like, yeah, sometimes it just happens to be like certain people, you know, feel the calling of one saint and tend toward them. But he's going to disappoint his father by becoming a priest, because you don't make as much money being a priest as a lawyer. It's still true today. At 22, he's going to become a monk, and he's going to study. He's really going to like St. Augustine. Really, really like St. Augustine. He's kind of a central figure, which I wish I had the time to like go over notes on him, but we'd be pushing like the timeline back way farther. Basically, like the Roman Catholic Church at this time and the Protestants are both going to claim Augustine is on their side during this whole thing, and Augustine could have his own like 3-hour stream dedicated to him. We're not gonna get into really that Thomism or Scholasticism, because that is like a whole big thing. So let me take a drink here before we get started on this next one here. Are we still good, by the way? Any kind of like clarifications or like questions? Am I moving too fast, or yes? Yeah, go ahead. Well, I'll answer as best as I can. I am not. Oh, we're good. Okay. I feel like I should have like mentioned at the start of the stream. Like, probably late in. I'll probably include it at the beginning. Once I like upload this, I'll edit it in. I only have a bachelor's degree. I'm not specialized in any kind of area. This is just stuff that I like reading on my own time. So if I get anything wrong at any point, I apologize. I'm also, I guess, like somewhat biased. I don't know. I have somewhat like an outside perspective on this because like both of my church traditions existed outside the Reformation. Being like Southern Baptist, like not really a Reformed tradition, and then Orthodox, they're kind of having issues at this time, so not really involved here. But alright, moving on with Luther. His doubts are going to arise with the church in the early days of his priesthood, when he visits Rome. He's going to have claimed... Oh god. Yeah, that guy. Yeah. Oh, that's a whole... yeah, his credentials are probably just about as valid, or probably less so than mine. But when Luther's visiting Rome, he claims in like his collected works to have overheard like a couple of priests openly mocking and making light of the Eucharist when out of earshot of the laity. And then kind of seeing just like how they live, dressing lavishly and living in like these really expensive living quarters. He also, the longer he spent in Rome, he had this idea of Rome, like, of being like this holy place where like he's going to go on pilgrimage and he's going to have this like, you know, deeply spiritual experience. The opposite kind of happens with him. The longer he's there, he kind of starts to view Rome as like a tourist site, basically. With like all these different churches and places like kind of, you know, showcasing and like advertising, like we have the relics of so-and-so saint, Burgess had the CK Topia pilgrimage event that makes you cynical. Exactly, yes. Like church, like individual priests. I think in some cases he saw that like some churches were like charging for the privilege to like to like actually buy some of the relics. There's a lot of relic collecting that goes on at this time. I think that it's either Charles V or his father at this time, one of the Habsburgs. They have this massive collection of like saints' relics, and they basically like make a section of their palace like a personal museum where they charge people to like come in and like look around and like view the relics of like various saints. So there's a lot of that going on too, like, like pass the priest like a little bit of money under the table and you can leave Rome with like the skull of like your patron saint, maybe, if you're like a wealthy noble or merchant. You can take it back home with you. Which is not how the relics of saints should be treated. You should not be buying and selling them. Before leaving the city, he's also going to go to the Scala Sancta, or the Sacred Stairs, which is a set of stairs. I forget exactly what building they're attached to. St. Peter's Basilica was not built at this time. We'll get into that. That's a big thing. But they're attached to like a famous church. But the stairs themselves, according to Roman Catholic tradition, are the original stairs that were transferred by St. Helen, the mother of Constantine the Great. Took the original stairs leading up to Pontius Pilate's offices, carried them back to Rome, and reinstalled them in this church. And prior popes, they didn't have that. One of them claimed to have the breast milk of Mary, which is a dubious claim. I'm not one to like speculate on like the relics of saints, but like that one, I'm a little. It's like I don't know. I don't know about that one. My laptop's about to die. We might have to. The prepuce. I don't know, dude. I have no idea. But with the Sacred Stairs. Oh, oh, thanks for that mental image, Largo. Thank you very much. That is exactly the chat message that I wanted to read. What a serious discussion of the Reformation. No. Oh my god. Oh. Better than other things Borges did. I'm so glad I didn't include a slide on the Borgias. We would be here all day, dude. So the Sacred Stairs of Pontius Pilate. Prior popes granted indulgences to those temporal indulgences to those who climbed the stairs like on their knees and like for each step saying like the Lord's Prayer, so like going up one stair at a time, like crawling up them. And it's not like 5 steps of stairs, it's like 40 or something. Praying the Lord's Prayer at each step. Which Luther did this himself in order to reduce the time that he would spend in purgatory. But upon reaching the top of the stairs, he reportedly like stated to have doubts like whether or not that actually did anything. All right, let me pull this up on this computer here since my laptop has just died. Okay, alright, I did not just flash my full name via Microsoft Word. Thank you. Okay. Which slide are we on? We are here. Okay. So yeah, he would start to have doubts on like whether or not. So at this point, he doesn't reject the idea of purgatory necessarily. He's doubting like whether or not the Pope himself has whether or not the Pope has the authority to like bind and loose people to purgatory. But at this point, and like even when he posts the 95 Theses, he's kind of starting to like formulate the idea like if anyone has the authority to do that, it's really just God himself. But then, of course, like later on, he is just going to outright reject the idea of purgatory altogether. Once he gets back to the Low Countries in Germany, the straw that breaks the camel's back for him is going to be Johann Tetzel, which this part of Luther's story is rather famous, and like most people know about this. And there's even like a movie, I think made in like the 80s or 70s, that kind of depicts a lot of scenes involving Tetzel and Luther. I don't think they actually ever met each other. I think Luther just like read tracts from Tetzel and like heard his preaching secondhand. I might be wrong, but I don't think they ever had like a personal encounter with each other, like how the movie depicts it. But to give context for this, at this time, the St. Peter's Basilica, like the big, like massive cathedral within Rome, that like everyone sees like on the news, like whenever like the Pope's in Rome, like doing stuff, that's not built yet. But the papacy is gathering money to build it. And to do this, this is where like a lot of like contention pops up, like even today, like still in modern times, with like Protestants and Catholics like discussing indulgences, is that the papacy is using the funds from indulgences to build the cathedral. So like we discussed earlier with indulgences, what they are is they're essentially these little scrips of paper that you have to do a spiritual action and to get them to reduce your time in purgatory. And like one of these spiritual actions is, you know, donating money to the building of St. Peter's Basilica. And if you do that, you get indulgence with a little wax seal depicting an artist's rendition of like what they thought like the finished basilica would look like. This one time, I'll kind of like let like my bias out a little bit. When researching this, a lot of like Catholic defense for this is that like, well, the church wasn't selling indulgences; they were merely just giving indulgences for the spiritual action of providing a donation, which is kind of pedantic a little bit, in my opinion. But like in the case of Johann Tetzel, what like bothers Luther about this is, you know, like he had a bunch of these little like, I don't know if like they'd be the equivalent of like a jingle for like an advertisement. And like his most famous one is like in when the coin in the coffer rings, a soul from purgatory springs. Yet giving indulgences away in exchange for money, but they weren't sold. Yes. Which is like, okay. It's like, okay, like the it's like, well, it's not technically true, but it's like, okay. He also had some other stuff that he said, which, let me see here. I think I didn't have another one written down, but he had another one that Luther got really mad about. Yeah, as soon as the gold in the casket rings, the rescued soul to heaven springs. Johann Tetzel, essentially his strategy to get donations for the Basilica was to essentially tug at people's heartstrings in a way that, like, what he also did was, which, like, I will grant to, like the Catholic side of, like, this whole thing, is he did preach that the donations used could grant remission of time in purgatory for either the person donating themselves or for other people, including family members, which is, like, the thing that, like, really pissed off Luther. As far as I'm aware, and as far as I've looked into it, there had never been any kind of doctrine saying that, like, another person... There have been no cases of, like, doctrinal statements saying that one person could take away time for another person in purgatory. It's all just, like, individual. So, like, for instance, I couldn't say, give money to build the Basilica and say, like, instead of granting me time away from purgatory, like, pass it off to, like, my great-grandfather, or whatever. There had been nothing, like, doctrinally that had stated that, so to be fair. But, yeah, he would essentially, like, you know, say, like, you know, if you really care for the souls of, like, your family who's departed, and, like, you know, think about, you know, like, the amount of time they're spending in, like, the fires of purgatory, like, don't you want to give money to, like, decrease that time and also, like, build this, like, great church all the way in Italy? That really made Luther upset, to say the least. Yeah, further provocation from, like, essentially, like, emotional manipulation, which I'll also input, like, giving money to donate to, like, to, like, grand cathedrals is, like, in and of itself not wrong. It's just the way in which it's done, like, very manipulatively, is the issue here. So, officially, with, like, what most historians will state, like, I would push the state back to Jan Hus, but that would, like, have the timeline of the Reformation be, like, 100 years longer, and you got this little lull period where not a lot's going on. October 31st, Luther is going to post the 95 Theses on the church door of Wittenberg, and the scene you see in a lot of artwork isn't, like, in reality would not have been as dramatic as it's, like, depicted, with, like, I wish I had gotten a picture for it, because, like, there's one famous one that, like, everyone knows when they hear the 95 Theses. It's Luther is, like, standing at the church door, you know, like, nailing the tract, like, onto the door, and, like, everyone's looking at him, like, shocked that, like, he's doing that, when, like, in reality, the church door in Wittenberg was, like, a bulletin board. Anyone could post, like, anything up there. It'd be like a notice board at, like, a university, where, like, people are just posting, like, events, or, you know, like, advertising classes and stuff like that. It would just be, like, everyone would post, like, whatever they wanted to up there. It was, like, a little, like, forum, essentially. It's like him nailing the theses to the door wouldn't have been, like, that big of a deal in itself. It'd be like what's actually written on it. Which even then, how many cat drawings do you think are on the church doors? There's a lot of this is kind of off topic, but with the Hagia Sophia, there's a lot of like graffiti from like Varangian guards. Who are just saying, just like say like with like graffiti saying like I was here or whatever. Historic graffiti is always a like really fun thing to look into. But like the 95 Theses are essentially just like Luther's still at this point. His goal is not to break away from the church. He doesn't have in his head that like I'm going to form the Lutheran Church. The 95 Theses are basically just like 95 points of discussion that he's wanting somebody to debate him on. He's just essentially saying like I want to talk about like these with somebody, and I think I wrote a couple of these down just to like kind of give like some context. So some of the things written down here included, these aren't doctrinal statements, these are just things that he's like wanting to have a debate to clarify these points. So like point number 5 is the Pope neither desires nor is able to remit any penalties except those imposed by his own authority or that of the canons. So essentially he's putting forward the discussion point that like, okay, if the Pope is able to take time off of purgatory for people, he doesn't actually want that because he could just do that of his own free will. He doesn't need people to perform actions, spiritual actions to do this. It's just an arbitrary decision of him, is this correct or not? Number 6, the Pope cannot remit any guilt except by declaring and showing that it has been remitted by God, or to be sure, by remitting guilt in cases reserved to his judgment. If his right to grant remission in these cases were disregarded, the guilt would certainly remain unforgiven. So, arguing, or asking for like an argument on, is the Pope remitting the sin, or is he remitting the sin through God who is giving him authority to do it? Number 26, the Pope does very well when he grants remission to souls in purgatory, not by the power of the keys, which he does not have, but by way of intercession for them. So again, like the Pope himself, is the Pope himself giving the remission, or is he serving as like an intercessor for the remission? 27, they preach only human doctrines who say that as soon as the money clinks into the money chest, the soul flies out of purgatory. I wonder who he's talking about. 47, Christians are to be taught that the buying of indulgences is a matter of free choice, not commanded. So, again, the 95 Theses are not claims of what Luther himself believed, but they're a disputation. So, again, like asking for a debate. For a moment, I thought Pope Cell's seething, Luther Chad's winning. Yeah, so whether or not any kind of debate occurred, it's not clear. I don't think there is any record of it, so most likely it didn't happen. The Pope at this time was like dealing with a bunch of other stuff, so kind of like having this one upstart, this one German monk get like a little like uppity was like not really his concern. He's dealing with a bunch of other stuff at the time, like the Ottomans. There's a couple wars going on between the HRE and France, and just like he's not concerned about Luther at this point. But Luther did send a letter to the Archbishop of Mainz, basically telling on Tetzel, being like, hey, this guy's running around your diocese, which Tetzel wasn't even like under his authority, so Johann Tetzel did get reprimanded for that, for like preaching outside of like his authorized diocese. Breaking news: German man goes crazy like all the Germans. Reoccurring theme of European history: Germans and mucking it up for everybody else. Very, very true. But like Tetzel essentially gets like a slap on the wrist. He doesn't get defrocked. He basically is like just like told, hey, stop doing that. You're not allowed to preach anymore, but like you get to go have like a cushy life in this like wealthy monastery. Get out of here. Essentially is what happens to him. Yeah, at this point Luther's not against the doctrine of indulgences themselves, but is like taking issue with like the misunderstanding that like the populace has because of the preaching of Tetzel. Something which has kind of remained to this day, like what indulgences actually are. When you talk to most people, they're not exactly clear on like understanding like what they are. Not to say that like this is not me saying that like the doctrine of indulgences are correct or not. It's just that like most people's understanding to what they are supposed to be doctrinally is inaccurate. Like for instance, like other examples of here. Yeah, I have a little note, like quick note on indulgences. They are doctrinally not supposed to be an exchange of money for the forgiveness of sins. What they are is a grant for the lessening of temporal punishments on earth or in purgatory. We did, however, kind of point out that like you can kind of like weasel around the point that it's like, well, the indulgences aren't being sold. It's just a donation from the person, and it's like, okay, you can kind of lawyer your way around it a little bit, but indulgences doctrinally aren't supposed to be sold, as it would broadly fall under the sin of simony. But other examples of indulgences can include like performing a pilgrimage, going to confession, and being told to perform an act of penance, like praying a certain amount of like Hail Marys and Our Fathers or other spiritual acts. So there's like a bunch of like other stuff like you can do for it, but because of like how like legalistic a lot of Roman Catholic doctrine is, you can kind of like sidestep some stuff with indulgences in the case of like the donation aspect of it. So as he goes like on like later on, let's see, okay, yeah. So as he goes like further on, Luther does eventually get pushed into like just breaking with the church. He's going to argue later that good works must be done in faith or they're useless. Free will exists only nominally after the fall. Later is going to argue for sola fide, sola gratia, and sola scriptura, and would eventually reject the doctrine of purgatory. Because of this, he's going to get excommunicated 3 times by his Augustinian order that he's a part of, Charles V, and then Pope Leo X. Because in 1519 he's going to deny the primacy of the Pope and the infallibility of general councils. This does include ecumenical councils. So, in terms of like, if we want to like bring in like what like, which, if you ever want to read about like there are like commentaries now being put out by like the Eastern Orthodox Church. One of which I did use as kind of like some sources for like the early lives of many of these performers. Josiah Trenham's Rock and Sand is a really good, if you want to get like that kind of view on the Reformation, that's a really good book. Weirdly enough, with his problem with the church councils, he is going to advocate that like the emperor calls councils to solve theological issues, which is like what he's critiquing, because a lot of the early church councils were called by the Eastern Roman emperors. So you get into this weird kind of like circular problem where Luther's saying that like church councils can't be infallible. You know, like, instead we need to have, like, the Holy Roman Emperor call these other councils, like, of local church leaders to, like, solve theological issues. It's like, okay, well, wait. It's like, which one do you want? But after this, he's going to be summoned by a hearing, much like Jan Hus. It doesn't go as bad for Luther as Jan Hus. He doesn't get burned at the stake. Which is called the Diet of Worms. I think Charles, at this point, Charles V is like 15. So, this is like... And he's got a lot of stuff going on, which, like, we'll talk about later. But, like, Charles has got, like, a full plate right now. He kind of, like, is wanting to, like, you know, stamp this, like, as quickly as possible. But oddly enough, like, well, it's not that he wouldn't want to, it's that, like, Luther gets an ally with, like, the Elector of Saxony, I think, to basically, like, keep him in hiding. So, in part, that's why he doesn't meet the same fate as Jan Hus. He gets, like, the Prince of Saxony to kind of, like, help him. Charles was crown maxing. He had, we'll show that off later. He has a lot of land. But yeah, he goes into Saxony, under the protection of the prince there, where he's going to make the first German translation of the Bible. However, he is going to make some pretty big changes. Let me see here if I have, like, the little note here. I think I do. Yeah, so he's gonna make some key changes. When he is translating, in some cases, he's going to outright remove whole books, which will later become, like, the Protestant Apocrypha. I don't think I have a list of... which books he took out. I can look this up really quickly, though. I know Maccabees is going to be one of them. So Luther's canon is... yeah, it rejects the Deuterocanon, which is going to include the book of Tobit. He's going to take out Tobit, Judith, some verses from Esther. Oh, he's going to take out both first and second Maccabees. I thought it was only the second. Wisdom of Solomon, Wisdom of Sirach, Baruch, the letter to Jeremiah, and some verses from Daniel. And also, when writing his commentaries, he kind of favors some books, and he kind of, like, doesn't outright reject, but he kind of, like, sees some books as, like, lesser than others, which kind of, like, clash with his own personal theology. Like the Book of James, he doesn't, like, specifically for the, without, what is it? Let's see. Because of the verse, without works, faith is dead. Let me make sure I'm quoting this right. Yeah, so because of 2 James, for as the body without the spirit is dead, so faith without works is dead also. He wasn't a fan of that, but he kept the book nonetheless. He doesn't really like Maccabees, mostly because there's an instance in Second Maccabees where Judas Maccabees is praying to I believe to his father and like some of the other Israelites who had died previously in the Maccabean revolt. And it's that Second Maccabees is kind of like used in apologetics in the Roman Catholic and Orthodox side to kind of like justify the idea of the intercession of saints. And while Luther does keep the saints, he kind of like downplays the ideas of intercession and many of the other doctrines surrounding them. He would also add to Romans 3:28 to kind of fit in his idea of sola fide. So like, and Luther would argue that like, although in the Greek, which I can read like the original translation versus his here. So the original would be, "For we reckon that a man is justified through faith apart from the works of the law," versus Luther's, "For we reckon that a man is justified through faith alone apart from the works of the law." And Luther and many of the other reformers who would like take his translation would argue that in the Greek, it's the alone part is kind of like implied, and therefore like explicitly adding it in is not a true addition, and like that adds to like that's like there's like a whole 500-year like debate around that. So essentially, like, kind of like letting my like opinion slip through with like the little like last bullet point though, essentially kind of like making himself like a sole authority in and of himself, ironically enough. So much later, like, we've still got a lot of like slides to go, which we'll talk about, but like kind of like flash forwarding. You can kind of see the fallout of like what happens here. A lot of other reformers kind of like take to Luther's example, and instead of rather like just agreeing with him wholeheartedly, start to develop their own theology like much in the same way he does. So you get like all these like big splits and like this never-ending splintering from the Reformation. This EU format looks weird, which continues today. I think recently the Lutheran Church itself had like a split, and I think technically now there are at least 3 branches of Lutheranism, I think. So like in discussion of like the Reformation for like why it even matters, like talking about it, it's like it's technically still ongoing. If like you want to like really make that argument, it's still kind of ongoing. Yeah, Lutheran books are gonna be like this is gonna like start like a whole like he's just blown up like the powder keg at this point. Much like John Wycliffe, his books are going to be collected and burnt in England, Venice, Naples, Castile, and France. Very, very ironically, Henry VIII is going to be named the defender of the Catholic faith for publishing anti-Lutheran tracts, burning his books, and defending the sacraments. Very, very ironic. Wars of religion look like the real total war. Yeah, it gets bad. Early on, most princes, including the emperor, are going to denounce Luther. But some of the lesser, like, princes, like, as in, like, those who don't have, like, as much territory or are, like, not as wealthy, are gonna end up, like, backing Luther because, like, a lot of them gather that, like, if we split from the church, that's like a big portion of money taken away from the tithes I have to give to Rome. And if I establish a state church, much as like what'll happen in like Denmark and Sweden, I can instead, like, you know, basically you can just get like double up on taxes and like just immediately increase my wealth. So, like, a lot of, not to say that, like, not to be, like, cynical and say, like, oh, the only reason, like, the princes went Protestant is because for, like, monetary gain. That's, like, not really the case, but it is a factor. They're like, most likely were, like, very genuine, like princes who are genuinely, like, in agreement with Luther, but, like, there is a major factor of, like, economic benefit to be made to, like, split from Rome. So he's so upset. He's so upset by this. Poor Leo. Look at what you've done to Leo. Don't you feel bad? Prince Eugene Crabbe's notorious Gershon picker. Don't you feel bad for Julian or for Leo? Leo, this sounds like what you've done here, Luther. Look at him. He's so upset. He's so upset by this. Oh, I've moved some of the slides around, so I gotta find this. So the Church, Roman Catholic Church, is going to take some of Luther's criticisms into consideration. Dude, he's so upset. He's so sad. Instead of doing what they did with Jan Hus, to give them credit, they didn't just immediately go, which they will in the future though, but, like, immediately, to be fair, they did immediately not, like, call a crusade and start burning and, like, killing people. War wagons did not have to come out early. They are going to try and, like, reform, which is going to be called, like, the Counter-Reformation or the Catholic Reformation. Kind of taking into consideration, like, the poor state of religious education for both clergy and laymen. The biggest and most obvious thing that they did was, like, the Council of Trent, which gathered from, like, 1546 to 1563. So really, really long period of time. They had a lot of stuff to go over. And the purpose of, like, the council was to... So... Oh, did the string go out? Resoldered. Yep, so okay, my phone just, like, chat is, like, disconnected. I probably should have took into account, like, where the chat box was going to be here. That's my bad. Stream's still going. So kind of, like, during this time, and, like, I kind of, like, implied it briefly, like, the period of, like, where the Black Death happened, and a lot of, like, religious education kind of became stagnant. A lot of doctrines in the Catholic Church had kind of been taken for granted at this time, and just kind of presupposed rather than seen as having to be, like, taught and explained to a lot of clergy and lay people. So the council was called to kind of, like, codify, clarify, and reinforce some of the doctrines, like the creed of the church, status of Scripture, like where it stands with church tradition, what the church's stance on original sin is, what the stance on justification, the sacraments is, what the Eucharist is, and what's going on there, the doctrine of penance, the monastic orders, where they're placed in the churches, kind of solidifying and defending purgatory, relics of the saints and their veneration, and then finally, like, the idea of indulgences. Council of Trent is really big for the church because it's still kind of, like, outside of Vatican I and II. The Council of Trent is, like, the most... It's the one council that's, like, still most applicable to the Catholic Church today, aside from those two. Because what it did was, it formalized the Tridentine Mass, which is like now called the traditional Latin Mass. So they're finally kind of like coming out and saying, okay, like when you're doing Mass, like this is what we're doing, and the to a lot of like people who are from like lower churches, it can kind of seem like odd. So like a lot of like criticism, like I remember like when I was younger of like Catholic services is that like from like lower church Protestantism is that like they didn't like that they were like following a script. Like the reason they're doing this is more so to kind of like create and strengthen a sense of unity when like during this time like a lot of church division is like happening with Luther and the other reformers. So like that's kind of the purpose of the formalization of the Tridentine Mass. It's to kind of like create this feeling of like reinforcing the old medieval idea of like Christendom and like the uniting of like the entire church across Europe. Now, of course, the traditional Latin Mass is kind of slowly being phased out, and like ironically enough, the Roman Catholic Church is kind of going through like another Reformation almost with what is it? The Novus Ordo, and in some cases, like oddly enough, it's kind of becoming more. I've seen like some Catholic masses that like would not look out of place at like an evangelical church, like weirdly enough, like with acoustic guitar, church bands and everything, which is kind of weird to see. Leo X would like probably be very confused at what's going on. He'd probably have the same face he does right here now. He's like, oh no, the Germans. Like, oh no, the Germans have done it again. Oh, I have another little footnote here. Oddly enough, Luther is a skeptic of the inclusion of the Filioque in the Nicene Creed, which is, I was really surprised to see that, which is like, I think this is the reason why Luther tried to start dialogue with the Orthodox Church, because he was kind of skeptical of the Filioque, because he was having trouble finding like scriptural backing for it. But in response to this, like the Reformers just further rejected purgatory. So like the Catholic Reformation really didn't do too much to bring a lot of people back into the church. I'm sure there's like a few people who kind of like flip-flopped at this time from like following Luther to the church when some things were clarified, but like I can't imagine it's like a whole lot. I don't have like any numbers on that, and I don't think there'd be any way to track that, but for the most part, there weren't a lot of like reconverts, so to speak. Around this time also, we finally have this move to like establish formal seminaries. So like it kind of like discussed a little earlier with Erasmus and Luther. For most people going into the priesthood at this time, or rather before, you didn't have official seminaries. What would happen is if you wanted to become a priest, or you were just kind of thrust into the role, what would happen is you would essentially be an apprentice, much in the same way you would if you were like a child becoming a carpenter or a blacksmith. You would just be assigned to a priest or bishop at a young age. You know, you would maybe be like serve as like an altar boy or acolyte during services. You would, do stuff like perform menial tasks like cleaning the church, helping prepare meals, like other, basic chores like that. Like maybe learning a few phrases in Latin here and there. You move on to become a deacon, get like a more in-depth education, but like not like anything formalized. That changes here to kind of like finally start to solve the problem of like the poor education going on in the church at the time. I do have written down here the crackdown on the abuses of selling indulgences and the worldliness of the clergy. The Dominicans are gonna do a lot of the second here. I'd probably maybe I wouldn't say like it's. I'd probably rephrase this to be like the church at this point is going to walk back a little bit on its stance on indulgences, and at this time, like they're gonna kind of stop doing the whole donation thing. I'm sure like if like any Catholics like end up watching this, will probably like take umbrage with that, like saying like no, they finally did crack down on it, but it's like it's more of like a walking back on their position on it almost. Here, I'll move on to that. I have a few more notes on that. I do have a little bit of notes on the Dominicans establishing some stuff at this time. So yeah, like one of the biggest moves in education also is the first like modern idea of Sunday school also appears here, weirdly enough. In Milan, there's a Franciscan priest called Abate Castellano de Castello, where in 1535 he decides to start educating young boys on scripture, like encouraging them to like come to spend time at the monastery whenever they have like time off away from like performing like familial duties and like working on the family farm and like spending time in the monastery, and he would like promise them with like free meals essentially if they would do that. We also have the rise of the Inquisition at this time, which the Roman Inquisition and the Spanish Inquisition are two separate entities. Both would kind of like crack down on heresies most of the time, establishing courts and like killing heretics as you do, but the Roman Inquisition was a lot less militant than the Spanish one. But there are still going to be like people set on trial during that time though. Nowhere near as much as the Spanish one. It's like I think the numbers are like only in the thousands, which like relative to the like in the like few thousand, like to 100, which like in comparison to the Spanish one is like low. Oh, how many more slides we got here? See my slides on Zwingli and Calvin. Oh, we can skip past them. We are going for a little while here. I have notes on Zwingli and Calvin. I will probably just like skim through both of them because we are kind of getting close to the 3-hour mark and haven't even started the game. I don't even know if we'll do that today. We'll just like skim over them. Finally talk about your favorite family. Oh yes. Meet the Fuggers. So, kind of stepping outside a little bit from like the religious aspect of the Reformation. You can see the vomit patchwork of the Holy Roman Empire right here. And on the right, a kind of like classification of like what kind of governments are going on here. It is. You want to talk about a decentralized state? Here you go. Here you go. So around this time, like as I kind of mentioned before, Charles V is reigning as the Holy Roman Emperor at this time. Charles V is from the famous House of Habsburg. Masterful map design. At this point, Charles is not only limited to his rule in Germany. Keep in mind, he's around like, I think around 15 to 17 at this time, I believe. This is a list of all the titles that he personally holds. So, Charles V of Habsburg is going to be the Emperor of the Holy Roman Empire. He's going to be the King of Spain under the royal name Charles I. He is the Archduke of Austria, the Lord of the Netherlands, and the Duke of Burgundy. And he is also, at this time, going to have land holdings within America at this point, also in Mexico and in the Caribbeans. So I think I have a slide for that. Yeah. So yeah, before the British Empire, the House of Habsburg had a lot of land. Habsburg Big. Also, if you look up Charles V, he is also, I think, the first case of the unfortunate appearance of the Habsburg chin. There's specifically one painting of that was commissioned when he was a kid with the rest of his family, and they're starting to look a little iffy. If only later Habsburgs formed the Austro-Hungarian Mexican Empire. So yeah, the HRA at this time, yeah, Maximilian, yeah. So, huge, massive, very profitable empire. Around this time, the Italian states are kind of superseded by Germany at this point. Germany is both the political and economic superpower at this time. Italy has kind of gone off to the side, mainly because the Fugger family. You get all your laughs out now. And there's a lot more free cities in Germany than there are in Italy at this time. I wish I had taken more time to get notes on as to why this was. I think it was mainly because oddly enough, a lot of the economic colonies set up by Venice and the other Italian states began getting a lot more taxes put on them, and kind of getting blocked off from the Ottomans, which is kind of one could argue that it's either karma or divine retribution, whatever you'd say, for the Fourth Crusade, which ended up the plan being to get a monopoly in the Eastern Mediterranean now that the Ottomans have taken over, which is only allowed because of what happened in the Fourth Crusade, is now coming back to bite Italy, and Germany is kind of taking up the mantle now. Yeah, but you know. Who's to say? Who's to say? Alright. So. Moving on to more political stuff going on. Oh, yeah, okay, wait. Alright, so before we get to the Peasants' War, a little bit more stuff about what's going on politically within the HRE. Um, although this is the peak, this time is like the peak of like the Holy Roman Empire's power in Europe. It's also like a big time of crisis for them because he's concerned about a ton of stuff right now at the moment. So not only is the Reformation popping off and threatening both political and religious disunity within the empire, the 30 Years' War is like going to happen in the 1600s and like essentially divide the empire and like fracture it. But outside of that, Charles is managing wars with France in the 1520s, like while Luther's kind of just getting his start at actually starting the Reformation. He's also got a series of revolts in Castile when he's, essentially like taking over the land there. The people in a lot of the cities in Castile aren't happy that a German who doesn't even speak Spanish, who's not living in Spain, he's living in like the Netherlands, is now ruling over them. So they're not happy about that. This happens a lot during this time. It happened with like the Norman conquest of England. Basically, like in any kingdom, if your king is like a foreigner and he doesn't like even speak your language, you're gonna get revolts happening because like people see it as like we don't even have our own king in the kingdom, and so that causes revolts like anytime that happens. But because of all this, it's kind of understandable why Charles wants to remain on the papacy's good side and to crack down on a split with the empire, because if he sides with Martin Luther at this point, not only is would he have to go up against like all of his other subjects that are loyal to the papacy, that'll only embolden France and Spain to like continue fighting against him and maybe drag England in with him. It's like being king of a people means you're literally the head of those people. And again, to like make matters even worse for Charles, Suleiman the Great becomes Sultan at this time, and is like... So the Ottoman conquest of the Byzantine Empire, that's like not their stopping point. Like they are planning to like go even further, and like, as like if anyone knows anything about this time period, like little guy named Vlad is like is doing his damnedest to stop it, and God bless him. He's a little extreme, but his heart's in the right place. The Ottoman Empire is like threatening the border with Hungary. Charles is thinking, oh God, if they take Hungary, like my border with Bohemia is like right there. So he's like, on all sides. Once again, Germany is like essentially caught in a three-front war, and it's not looking good. We in the business like to call this foreshadowing. So, yeah, if you're Charles, I'd imagine he'd be really stressed out at this point. I would not want to be in his shoes. To make matters even worse, there's a peasants' war going on in Germany. So around this time, this again goes back to like the whole discussion of like, because of the Black Death, there's like there's a decreased population of peasants who are able to better negotiate, better pay living standards with their liege lords. But it's not like this one-sided thing where like the lords essentially just like lay on their backs and was like, okay, I guess we gotta give in to the peasants. There's gonna be some pushback with both like the nobility, and early on, like 2 years before the Peasants' War, there's actually going to be a revolt from some knights who, much in the same way the peasants, feel like they're being essentially screwed over by the nobility, because a lot of German princes are using Roman law to undermine the contracts they have with peasants and the knighthood. Essentially, like, what in some cases will happen is if you're a lower knight or peasant, you essentially have no legal recourse to make any kind of dispute with your liege lord if he like decides to, let's say you're a peasant, right, and you've got like this plot of land, like a tiny little farm, and you've got a little lake that you like to go fishing on. Your liege lord can come in and say, I'm using that lake to start a fishing venture right now. It's now mine. Go cry about it. Or if your liege is on a hunt and his quarry just so happens to run through your wheat field, he could just ride right through it and ruin your crops, and you kind of have to deal with it. So, that's gonna, as you can imagine, that's gonna make a lot of people mad. Even if that hypothetical doesn't happen, the fact that you know that that could happen is gonna make you uneasy and kind of like resent your landlords a little bit. So what ends up happening is, I think do I have the 12 articles here? I do. Yeah, or if you have like a little bit of like woodland that you use to like chop firewood for, they can claim that as well. And when I say you don't have any legal recourse, like you could, hypothetically, if you had enough money, take them to a secular court. Problem is, the secular courts are headed by the upper class, and the nobility could just, bribe them. So you're kind of SOL if you're a peasant in this time, dealing with that. So essentially, like, a civil war is going to break out where a lot of peasants, begin, fighting and killing. The only legal recourse peasants have is to move to another domain where taxes are too high. Yeah. So that starts out a bunch of little engagements. The rebellion does get put down. Oddly enough, a lot of the peasants are going to cite Martin Luther as an inspiration, because what happens at the Diet of Worms, Luther is going to refuse to bow to Charles V, and they're going to take that to mean that he's advocating for civil disobedience toward any kind of like liege lords. Luther is going to be really upset by this, and he is going to encourage the nobility to put down the rebellion, because Luther's not interested in gaining the approval of like the common man, so to say. He's more focused on like getting the nobility to back him. Ulrich Zwingli, on the other hand, like another reformer, is going to like be the opposite. He's basically going to be like the polar opposite of and more extreme version of Luther, where he's going to be much more like anti-hierarchy, both in the church and in the secular life. He's going to full on like back the peasants' rebellion. Zwingli's an interesting guy. I'm not a big fan of him. He's kind of out there. But the summary of the 12 articles of the German peasants, basically, let me go over a few of these. Every town and village should be entitled to elect and dismiss its preacher if he misbehaves. The preacher shall preach the gospel simply, straight and clear, without human additions. Preacher shall be paid from the great tithe. Any surplus shall be used to help the village pay the poor and pay the war tax. Small tithes shall be abolished. It was invented by humans. For the Lord our God created livestock free for humankind. 3. Until now, it has been practiced that we have been treated like serfs, which is deplorable. Since Christ redeemed all for us with his precious blood, both the shepherd and the nobleman, with no exceptions. Accordingly, we hereby declare that we are free and want to remain free. 4. It is unbrotherly and not in accordance with the word of God that the poor man is not entitled to hunt game or fowl or to fish. since when God our Lord created man, he gave him power over all beasts, the bird in the air, and fish in the water. 5. The nobles have taken possession of the forest. When the poor man needs something, he must buy it for twice its price. Consequently, all the forests that were not bought, meaning former community forests, which many rulers had simply appropriated, shall be returned to the village so that anybody can satisfy his needs therefore for timber and firewood. 6. The excessive compulsory labor demands of us, which grows from day to day, should be reduced to the amount that our parents used to perform according to God's word. 7. The nobility shall not force us to perform more compulsory labor than was agreed upon. At this time it was common for nobles to raise unilaterally the compulsory labor they demanded from serfs. 8. Many fields cannot produce enough to pay the rent demanded for them. Honest men shall inspect these lands and set a fair amount of rent for them, so that farmers need not work for free, because each day's works deserve its pay. 9. New laws are constantly being made to impose new fines. Punishments are not being meted out depending on the offense, but instead in an arbitrary fashion, i.e. raising fines and arbitrary judgments were common. In our opinion, we should be judged in accordance with the old written law, according to the case's merits instead of on a whim. 10. Many nobles have appropriated meadows and fields belonging to the towns, commons which were at the disposal of all townspeople. We want them returned to all of us in common. 11. The toadfall, a sort of inheritance tax, shall be abolished altogether, based. And never again shall widows and orphans be shamefully robbed contrary to God and honor. It is our decision and final opinion at 12. If one or more of the articles listed herein contradicts God's word, we shall rescind them, if it is explained to us on the basis of what is written. If any articles are already granted to us and emerges afterwards that were unjust, they shall be null and void. Likewise, all this is subject to the condition that if additional articles are found here written that are against God and by agreements by some other person. Alright. Okay. This is like a little side. This is really like a little side note thing. I guess not really, because since we're zooming into HRE politics here. New Jerusalem is an interesting case. Where, so... Minecraft time. Yes! I have the power of God in Minecraft on my side, said Mr. Hoffman. Or Rothman, it's written here. Oh boy. So, let's talk about New Jerusalem, aka Munster, Germany, and aka Munster and Strasbourg, Germany. So, one of the weirdest things to happen during the Reformation, in my opinion, outside of like what the Anabaptists had going on, I didn't include a slide for them because it's kind of hard to talk about them because they had no like unifying doctrine or leadership. This is why the German kid went yippee with his Coca-Cola. Christ is coming back to Munster, Germany, 1540, yippee! So, New Jerusalem starts with the story of one Melchior Hoffman, little German fellow from the Low Countries, aka the Netherlands, who slowly went from being a Lutheran to a Zwinglian to finally an Anabaptist lay preacher. A lot of the weirder stuff comes out of like the Anabaptist Reformation, which, to clarify, like the Anabaptists like don't really have any kind of like relation to modern day, like if you're thinking like American baptism or like Southern baptism, that's not what these guys are. Although there are some like common doctrines between the two. The Anabaptists are mostly related to the Mennonites, Puritans, and later the I think the Quakers a little bit. I think so, but mostly like, yeah, the Amish. They're basically like the ancestors of the Amish. And Anabaptist just means like it was a derogatory, initially a derogatory term, which means rebaptizer, because they did not like the doctrine of infant baptism. But anyway, Mr. Melchior here made a reputation for himself by being involved in a lot of small religious revolts all across Germany, Poland, Estonia, Sweden, and Denmark. Denmark, oddly enough, he got the backing of the king there to become an official preacher, and he kind of paid him a stipend for a little bit. Mostly a lot of the man got around. Yeah, no, a lot of the revolts he was involved in arised out of like iconoclasm. So, which is like the rejection of like images, although they would argue like idolatry, but that's neither here nor there. This isn't a polemic stream. I won't get into autistic detail about that. But like in 1533, Melchior is going to study Revelations. So already starting off great. As all religious revolutions do. The man begins by reading Revelations and interpreting it. He came to the conclusion that Jan Hus had kicked off the beginnings of the prophecies of the apocalypse and the revival of true Christianity. He proclaimed himself to be one of the two witnesses mentioned in Revelation 11, which predate the harboring of the Antichrist and the return of Christ to Earth. And he determined that the city of Strasbourg was the location of the earthly return of Jesus, and that all ungodly people inside the city, i.e. everyone who disagrees with him, must be violently removed from the city preceding this event to purify it. His uprising doesn't go too well. It gets repressed by the local prince there, and he gets imprisoned for life, but his uprising gets some popular backing in other Anabaptist circles, and two of his followers, Jan Mathis and Jan Leiden, instead reinterpret his prophecy and instead say, it's not Strasbourg that's the site of the beginning of Revelation, it's Munster. And Munster is going to be the New Jerusalem. And Jan Mathis is going to claim to be the second witness from Revelation. This one had a slightly better outcome, as in, like, they succeeded in holding the city for about a year, but then later a bunch of local nobility and knights would siege down the city, and the rebellion would ultimately fail. So what's going to happen to Mathis and Leiden's followers, you can see here, they get burned at the stakes. Mathis, however, is going to be killed in battle via dismemberment, and his head is going to be stuck atop a pike. And then later his genitals are going to be nailed to the gate of the city. Leiden is going to be attached to a pole via a metal spike and tortured with heated tongs until dead, and then later displayed in a cage. His body is going to be put in a cage, and the cage is going to be hung above the St. Lambert's Church in Munster. Hoffman, ironically, the originator of all of this, he's going to get off with like just life imprisonment, but that doesn't last very long because he dies like 4 years after his initial imprisonment. This is not my full document, also. I need to sign in to see the full thing. Maybe that's why my PowerPoint didn't save. Hold on. One moment here. Let me open the OneDrive version of this. See if it saved that. Sorry about this. Like, cut off my notes, like, kind of halfway. And I remember having a lot more written here. Hopefully it saved it. Yeah, who won't touch the general gate? Exactly. Okay, I guess it didn't save it. Okay, interesting. We don't have much left anyway. All the other stuff is about Zwingli and Calvin, which, let's see. Let me see. See what's on my other account. Hope I didn't overwrite it with like the incomplete one. Incorrect password. Okay. Oh. I think we're... Oh, is it back? No. Okay, I think it's saved over it. Oops. Oh, that's great. Alright. Apologies for this. Let me see if it saved it anywhere else. I hate OneDrive, by the way. Absolutely can't stand it. Yeah, what the hell? Didn't save it. Okay. Alright, well, I guess that is gonna cut that short. If I manage to find the rest of it, I'll edit it in here. With like all the stuff mentioning Zwingli and Calvin. I'm really sorry about this. I should have like prepared like way better for this. But I've got like a little thing that's like still mentions here. Okay, yeah, Zwingli slides and Calvin slides are missing, which is weird because like Wolf saw me like making those like a few days ago. Anyway, so overall like fallout of Luther's Reformation is he's gonna be followed up by Zwingli, Jean Calvin, and the Anabaptists. So like I said, it's this like continuing like snowball effect that he has, where it ends up not becoming just like this split down the middle between like Lutheranism and Catholicism. Oddly enough, like whenever you make the doctrine like we're just going off of like the plain wording of the scripture, you come to realize that like the plain wording is not in fact plain, and the interpretations of different people are in fact going to differ very widely. Early on with the case of Zwingli, Luther hated Zwingli. He could not stand this guy. He's going to be based in Switzerland, and just like very quickly going over him. He's essentially like Luther if he was way more extreme in his stances. Because he's going to take sola scriptura to the stance of like, if anything is not like explicitly like ink not on the page mentioned in any kind of biblical text. It is not to be used. So, extreme iconoclasm. There's no Zwinglian churches left over nowadays, but like the joke with like Zwinglian churches is if you walked into a Zwinglian church, like the only thing you would see are 4 white walls and a pulpit, and that's it. Like not even a cross, because Zwingli was worried in extreme cases that like people would revere the image of the cross as an idol in and of itself. So no images whatsoever, no music during services. All the sacraments are symbolic only. Oddly enough, he would get into arguments with Anabaptists because he had a stance of like positive sola scriptura rather than like negative sola scriptura. So like he was pro infant baptism because through his interpretation of sola scriptura, there's nowhere in the Bible that explicitly says do not baptize infants. He was like, okay, it's there we go. The Anabaptists would say, well, no, because it's not written there. Don't do it. And Zwingli's retort to that, which I found funny, Zwingli's retort to that was, if we're going off by that logic, then no women should be given communion, because in the Bible, no women are mentioned during the Last Supper. Some of the debates going on in the Reformation, oddly enough, resemble YouTube religious debates in some way. I don't know why, but I found that exchange very funny. So, yeah, you go to a Zwinglian. I imagine Zwinglian services being incredibly boring because you walk in there and it's just white walls and like a sermon, like no music, no nothing, like no sacraments going on. Zwinglianism doesn't really have a lasting effect. There's not a whole lot of churches that or traditions that like follow his example. There are a couple of they call themselves the Swiss Brethren, but there's not a lot of them. It's essentially like kind of like a Swiss version of like the Amish that kind of like keep up the tradition of Zwingli, but like for as extreme and as loud as a person Zwingli was, he didn't leave that much of an effect on like the Reformation as a whole. The Anabaptists, which arguably like had a really big effect, like especially for like the founding of like America, since a lot of them would like go on to be like persecuted in England and go off to like be the ancestors of the Puritans. They're like I said, they're kind of hard to talk about because there's like Anabaptist is really like an umbrella term rather than like its own branch, so to speak. They grew out of like Zwinglian teaching, oddly enough, for as much as they didn't like each other. They opposed him for like being too extreme, like most people did. And they rejected both Luther and Zwingli's view on baptism, that it wasn't a sacrament in which like an actual cleansing of sin is happening. It's more of like a pledge, like stating that like at this moment they're becoming Christian. That's the only view that modern day like American Baptists really share with them. That's about it. And this is where like the age of reason baptism kind of like, or the believer's baptism kind of like appears. And yeah, it's difficult to address like their other individual views and beliefs because of like just how atomized they are. But like why the unifying thing is that like they believe that like only adults within the age of reason should be baptized. What the age of reason was also up for debate among them. For some, it was, like 15. For some, it was like 12. Some was like in your 20s. It just depended like which kind of cell of Anabaptists that you were in at the time, really. Calvin's is very short because Calvinism is the meme of the guy, you know, talking, like, fast forwarding with, like, the whiteboard. Calvinism is very difficult to dissect, but what most people know him for is, like, the belief in predestination, the total depravity of mankind, like double predestination. So, like, before God made anything, he'd already decided, like, beforehand, like, who's getting saved, who's getting damned, like, that whole thing. That's Calvin, which I feel like everyone knows, like, that specific part of Calvin. I was going to prepare notes on Calvin at, like, the last minute, and I couldn't. There's so much. He wrote so much stuff. I think he wrote a book called, like, the Christian Institutes, and that's, like, his basic theology. It's 2,000 pages. I can't read all that for, like, a non-academic presentation. This is just for me and, like, maybe 5 people to watch on Twitch. I'm not reading all that. I'm sorry. I'm sorry, John. I'm not reading that. So, more of the continuation of the Reformation. You get the Unitarians, specifically. There were Unitarians beforehand and, like, afterwards. Specifically the Socinians, which denied the Trinity because, again, through their reading of Sola Scriptura, they claim that nowhere within the Scripture was it explicitly stated that the Trinity was in fact a thing. They denied the pre-existence of Christ, because they, specifically for this, the justification they used, I believe, was they differentiated the Logos as being different from Jesus, the man himself. So, oddly enough, there were also, which heresy is that again? That's, I won't say which because I'm gonna like misspeak and forget it, but that's another early heresy. Calvin casually putting more effort in describing his theology. Imagine if game devs had that drive. Calvinism is the branch of Christianity for, like, theology nerds. Even though when the more you get into it, it doesn't kind of make sense, but whatever, and you have to kind of bend backwards for it to work, whatever. Omniscience of God is limited to the definite truth rather than the potential truth. The Adamites, which anyone who plays Crusader Kings knows these guys very well. The Adamites decided that a new sacrament should be instituted into the church where, during liturgy, they would become nudists, and doing so, they were returning to the purity of Adam and Eve before the fall. And I didn't include any images, even though they're, like, old artistic representations of it, because I'm afraid Twitch would, like, shoot me in the back of the head. But there's a lot of artwork of the burning of the Adamites, and it's just like, you've got, like, a naked guy, like, running in, like, a busy medieval street, and people, like, chasing after him. And it's just like insane. They also rejected marriage, again citing Sola Scriptura, by some weird reading. I forget exactly. They kind of, like, do this, like, mental work to, like, make that fit. In some cases, rejected transubstantiation and the Eucharist altogether. The Illuminists. The Illuminists are kind of odd because, like, there's this one case where like Josiah Trenham mentions in like his book Rock and Sand, which I wish I had like marked that down. There's a case of like, I think it's somewhere in Germany. There was another person claiming to be like a prophet. But for the Illuminists, whenever they talked about like having the Holy Spirit speak through them, it was more like possession. It's like, okay, your body is now the mech, and the Holy Spirit is like driving you. It's not that like you're being inspired. It's like, okay, like the driver's seat has now changed. So there's them, and then the Swiss. Okay, no. So the Swiss Brethren weren't Zwinglian. They're another ancestor to the Mennonites and the Amish, which they were a like strict non-violence group. We're almost done. So, briefly, like just going over this, I don't have any notes over this. The Reformation is like a continuing, like I said before, Reformation, I would argue, is like a continuing event that arguably has not ceased, because hundreds of years after Martin Luther, you now get like a Europe that is previously in medieval times with the idea of Christendom, this like united Europe under like a single church, like that was mainly focused on fighting against, you know, like the different sultanates and Islamic kingdoms in the Middle East. You now have a divided Europe that is like more so focused on internal conflict and like interstate conflict within the continent itself, like the 30 Years' War, the British Civil Wars, the Savoyard-Waldensian Wars, Huguenot Rebellion, and many, many more that we could have like tons more slides on. A lot of historians kind of mark this as like prior to the 20th century. This is like the most like violent time in Western Europe. 30 Years' War is like the amount of casualties that happened like within Germany alone would not be seen again until the First World War. To kind of like put into context like how contentious like all of this was. This wasn't like simply, whenever we think of like today, especially like since we're in like much more like relatively peaceful times, you're not gonna get like Protestants and Catholics going to war with each other over like, is the Eucharist really the body and blood of Jesus? You're not having like wars that decimate like a third of your population because of that. You're just getting into like internet spats. I use this slide to kind of illustrate just how like serious like these doctrines were to people. A lot of times, like especially nowadays, and like since we're like much more secular, you can kind of like write all this stuff off as like, that's kind of silly that like, you know, just because it's kind of a silly argument to have over like some bread and wine. It's like these were very serious like theological differences for these people at this time, and I don't think it's like honest to kind of like take them that lightly. Alright, that's just like some cool questions that I had written like mainly for myself, but like could be applied to like just like the overall like how do we look at the Reformation. So first off, like, were Martin Luther's reactions to the church's problems valid? I would probably add on to this point, like, did he, at what point exactly did he shift from wanting a reform to the church to seeing it kind of like there being no saving it and needing a complete like building from the ground up? For me personally, I'd probably say like the moment Luther got excommunicated, it probably became like a personal slight for him, to where he began shifting from wanting to reform the church to just going from there's no point in trying to reform this. we might as well just start over. What point did his Reformation go off the rails? Could anything have been done to keep his original goal of reforming and not breaking away? I'm not sure I would describe, like, Luther's Reformation. Well, Luther himself probably didn't... The Reformation, like, very most likely did not go the way he wanted it to, considering how combative he was with Zwingli. I have to wonder, like, whether later in life he had some doubts at the time on, like, whether or not he should have just, like, kept his head down and, like, just gritted his teeth and, like, bared the corruption in the church. I don't know. There's this whole argument of, like, the Reformation being inevitable. I don't know if there was any kind of timeline where it doesn't happen, and if there is, like, you'd have to go back probably, like, you know, thousands of years back to, like, the East-West Schism and, like, prevent that, to prevent the Reformation from happening. For all the reformers, the ultimate question is who has authority on practice and doctrine. Is it with a single person, a group or council, or with the individual? And then given the many offshoots claiming to be scriptural, can the plain text of Scripture be described as such? So, that's the end of all the slides that I still have saved here. We've gone 3.5 hours. I could have probably organized my notes a little bit better. This is my first time doing this, so this is a little rough. Any kind of, like, feedback afterwards, especially, like, for the VOD, is appreciated on how I can, like, organize this a little bit better, or maybe, like, focus down some stuff. I guess, do you guys have any questions here? No? We have any? You guys want to, like, throw? If you guys want to, like, throw in any thoughts you have about, like, the Reformation, or, like, any of the stuff that, like, we talked about, like, feel free. I don't know if we've gone for a little longer than I had previously thought. I didn't expect to go for this long, so I don't know if I have a little beat, so we might save Pentiment for let's see here. For maybe Tuesday. We'll save Pentiment for Tuesday, maybe. I could have spent more time with this, but I had already spent like a month and a half, like, putting this all together. And in between work and preparing for school, so, like, working a full-time job and preparing for, like, grad school, so, and working on, like, some D&D stuff, like writing that. So very, very, like, scattered with this. I wanted to try to keep this, like, to, like, basics. But I also didn't want to spend, like, 3 months working on this and, like, not ever put it out. But if you guys don't have any questions or anything to further input, I guess we can go ahead and call that here. Again, any feedback afterwards, once I upload this, will be welcomed. I would prefer any feedback to be posted, like, on the YouTube upload, just so I have, like, one place to look at it and actually respond to it there. And I will try to get this up as, like, quickly as possible, since I don't really have to do any editing for this one, like I do for the other streams. Yeah, we'll get to Pentiment this Tuesday then. And I forgot to forgot to add the new stream ending display. Oops. Oh well. Hell.